Hi, Grace and Brett. How are you guys today?
Doing good. How are you?
Good. There is no one in the room and just you guys here on Zoom. So I'm wondering, are you planning on coming in on Saturday?
I may or may not. I had a little situation. I got bit by a dog, so
Oh
I'm kind of been
no.
hobbling.
Oh no. Shoot.
So
Well, I'm sure it is hard to get around then, isn't it?
yeah, a little bit. That's why I'm not sure if I'll make it in or not. I'm going to try, but to be honest with you, right now the way things are looking, probably not. Sorry.
Well, that's okay. Oh, hi there. How are you?
Good, how are you?
Good.
Good.
Are you here for a refresher?
Yeah.
I
Yes.
love that idea.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Well, Christina's here now, so having someone in the room always makes it a little bit more engaging for me.
Yes.
Grace, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. I know that Brett is married to a realtor, and Christine has done a real estate transaction. Grace, tell me a little bit more about you.
What did you say?
Tell me just a little bit more about you.
Oh, well, I'm very new. Let me put my video on.
Hi.
I am very, very new. I think it's been a month now since I had my license. So I'm just here to learn about the forms. Jessica told me I need to come to this class. So
It's a really good thing to come to. So now I'll put my face on the screen so you can see. This is my 21st year in real estate, but I'm just 1 year into being here at Keller Williams. So I have the responsibility of helping you guys make sure that you do everything ethically and compliantly to make sure that all of your forms are done so that your clients have safety and security and all of the various steps of the real estate transaction, but especially the contract. So I am going to, the purpose of today is to make sure that you understand the forms and make sure that they're comfortable for you to talk through when you guys are doing them. So today is the buyer boot camp, right? Is it buyer, not seller? Okay, good. Today is the buyer boot camp, and I am going to log into the North Star MLS and show you all the documentation that you need to represent a buyer and to write a purchase agreement. Sound good? All right. It's a little bit dry, so forgive me. And bear with me. If you have something to take notes on, or if you could even pull up a purchase agreement on your computer, I think that would be helpful. Do you want a copy, or do you have yours, Christine, from before?
I don't have a paper copy. I think
Okay.
I left it at
I'll
home.
give you a
but-
copy.
Okay.
That way, if you
Thanks.
want to take any notes, you can.
Great.
So you'll go into North Star you'll go into North Star MLS. Sorry, guys. And you all know how to log in, correct?
yes.
Great. Once you have, this keyboard is giving me trouble. I'm sitting in a different spot, so maybe I have the wrong angle of my fingertips. Well, this is really weird. There we go. All right. You can move around all of these little blocks here that have your cart and your search and the news and alerts. I tend to have my external links down here over on the bottom left. So I go into just the bottom left, move it back a little bit. I go into the bottom left of my screen and I go to Minnesota Realtor Forms. And when you are creating a purchase agreement as compared to when you are creating just buyer representation forms, I do highly recommend that you go into an actual listing and create your forms from this, because it will allow you then to it auto-populates in the address, and it allows it to be created a little bit easier. So, oh, this is looking different to me too. This is so bizarre. Hang on one second here.
Should we just pull up a listing then today for?
That's a great idea. Why don't you guys just pull up any listing of your choice, just find something that's active, and you guys can create a transaction for it. But hang on one second. I literally was just in this yesterday. I don't know why this is looking different to me. All right. I don't know what I had to do.
Did they do an update?
Maybe.
Because mine's different too, and I was messing around with it last night, and it's way different now today.
Oh my gosh, okay, good. So I'm not crazy.
No.
So what I did then is I just clicked on the 3 lines up here, and I went down to transactions. And so that's where you will save transactions when you have offers that you're making or agency paperwork that you're doing. I'm going to go into my buyer bootcamp forms. But before I do that, because I know Christine is working out of a listing, why don't you guys each find a listing?
Okay.
You can use this one if you'd like. It's 6071870. And then you'll go down here to the icon that's a white square with a green kind of starburst on it. And you'll click on that. And it will take you through this wizard. And it'll ask you to utilize a template. And we're going to utilize the KWPR purchase agreement and buyer rep paperwork. So I'll let you guys.
What's the difference between those two? Just the purchase agreement paperwork and then the purchase agreement and the buyer rep?
Yeah, so I'll define this as I'm talking through them, but the buyer representation agreement is something that you would do with a potential buyer of yours, even if they don't have a property identified. So
Okay.
the proper way to do it is to go through the buyer representation form, and then at a second time with them, go through the purchase agreement paperwork. But we all know that in real life application and in reality, a lot of times you make an offer on a property and do the buyer representation paperwork all at the same time.
Oh, okay. So that's only if you haven't done the buyer rep paperwork with them and you're doing it all together.
Exactly.
Oh,
Yep.
okay.
607. No problem.
Oh, there it is. I see.
607-1870. Got it? Yeah. Okay. All right. So I'm going to have you guys just go through the wizard. You'll choose the template, the purchase agreement and the buyer rep paperwork. You'll create it. And then it will ask you a few other steps. It'll ask you if you want to identify a buyer, if you want to include yourself in the transaction. Jessica will be working on the wizard with you at a later time. So for efficiency and just to be efficient in our time, I'm going to assume that you've clicked next on all of these things and you've gotten to this spot where you can get into the transaction that you've created that now I've called buyer bootcamp forms. And you may want to call it the same thing just so that you can go back and reference it and remember it in the future.
Okay, I'm sorry, I
That's
just have
okay.
a question. So I pulled up the listing. Now, how do I get to the forms from the listing?
Yeah, no problem. So in the listing, you'll go down here to this white box with the green starburst, and or green kind of fan
Got
looking
it.
thing.
Okay.
Has everyone gotten through the wizard? Should I say, has anyone not gotten through the wizard? Do they want me to pause for a little bit?
I'm good.
All good over here.
Okay, awesome.
we're going to purchase agreement and buyer paperwork.
Yep.
Okay.
And then you can kind of just click through next on everything. When you do this for yourself, you'll want to be more detailed because it will increase your efficiency as you're doing the forms. But for now, just go ahead and go through real quick. Now I must admit, this view with the update is very different than what I'm used to. And I went up here to try to see if I could just see what I'm used to, and I can't. So you guys are gonna have to bear with me as you have this already so well.
Unfortunately, we can't revert to the old look, right?
What I'm looking for is for it to revert to the old look, but I just realized here, when I click on go to forms, this is what it does. It takes me to the forms that I want to present to you. And when you see it in this forms layout, it allows you to put it in the order that you want it to print out or that you want to work through it. So you can move these things all around. These are just in the order that I like to talk through them with you, and that I also like to talk through them with a buyer. So how are you doing on your wizard, Christine?
I think so. Somehow I
Are you
just got
getting there?
out of it. I kept clicking next, and then now I'm
Let me
back
take a
to
look.
that.
Okay, perfect. On the right-hand side, you'll see forms as the fourth word down.
Right here. Okay.
There you go.
Awesome.
Take a look. Then you have the same order that I do.
Okay.
Okay, good. As a licensed realtor, we are obligated to inform all consumers the various types of real estate relationships that we can interact with them in. And so this first form that I'll have you talk through with all buyers is the easiest form you're ever going to do because it's actually not a contract. It's truly just education. But if you can nail talking through this form, you can build trust and you can build rapport with your buyer. So it is a really important one and a really good one to start to memorize almost. There's some key things on all of these contract documents that are underlined, they're in bold, they're capital letters, so your prospective client's eyes are going to automatically be drawn to it. So I like to try to touch on some of those things. So I say to them, as a licensed realtor, I'm obligated by Minnesota law to inform you of various types of real estate relationships that we can have together. But I am pleased to tell you this is not a contract. This is just something that the Minnesota Association of Realtors wants us to have talked through with every potential consumer that we have. So as you probably know, you drive around town, you see for sale signs all over. Those sellers, those homeowners, have hired a real estate agent who works for a real estate brokerage to sell their home, and they're acting just in the seller's best interest. They're representing just the seller. In the case that we're in right now, as you guys are interested in buying a home of your own, myself and my real estate brokerage just represent you. We are just a buyer's broker. But occasionally there's going to be instances where the brokerage is representing both the seller and the buyer, or maybe even the realtor, is going to be representing both the buyer and the seller. And that's called dual agency. And as you can imagine, some people are not comfortable with that. Some people say, gosh, that seller's agent knows way too much, and now I'm giving you private confidential information about our negotiation. I'm not comfortable with dual agency. And we have to honor that if someone says they're not comfortable. In my 21 years, I've literally only had one person ever tell me that they wouldn't agree to dual agency. I'm sure there's a lot more out there, but for whatever reason, in my personal experience, I've only ever come upon one. Now, I do want you to remember a dual agent is if Jason Herkamp in our office has a house listed, and then you guys represent the buyer. So it's not just you representing the buyer and the seller, it's the real estate brokerage representing both the buyer and the seller. And I'll point out on the purchase agreement where you really need to be cognizant of that as well. This facilitation, I never had any experience with really until this year, and I think it's become more common because people are lining up buyers and sellers on their own. You know, Granny next door is saying, I think I'm ready to move into an apartment. And then someone down the street says, oh gosh, you know, my cousin has been wanting to move into this neighborhood for a long time. And these buyers and sellers come together on their own. They don't necessarily want to do all the paperwork on their own, but they don't feel like they need full agency representation. And ultimately, you know what that probably means? They don't want to pay full commission. But so people may sometimes work with a licensed realtor who's acting as a facilitator. And in the facilitator agreement, you'll see that there are some things, some fiduciary responsibilities that and duties that the realtor does not owe to that buyer or the seller. But in most cases, you'll be representing people as a seller's broker, a buyer's broker, and occasionally as a dual agency. And then you want to make sure that they understand that Minnesota law requires that these fiduciary responsibilities are adhered to. So as realtors, we must be loyal to them. We have to act in only their best interest. We need to be obedient. If they tell us to make a, $30,000 under listing price offer, we have to be obedient and do that of them. If they ask us to make some requests after the purchase agreement, but before the closing, we have to be obedient and do all of that. Of course, what I think is considered by a broker the most important is you need to properly disclose all material facts that we know, and you must be confidential in not sharing any information that they haven't given you permission to share. So start using that dialogue a little bit in terms of, my client has given me permission to share with you that, as you're talking with other realtors, because we do have a really important obligation to maintain their confidentiality. We need to use reasonable care, that goes without saying, and then we also need to use good accounting, and that really just comes down to the earnest money that people are exchanging. Occasionally people will be giving us earnest money checks, and we need to be responsible and respectful of that. There is something that we have to let them know, and this becomes a little awkward when you get to this point down here, but I try to phrase it by saying, as a licensed realtor, and just as the human that I choose to be, I am not discriminatory. I will not discriminate against anyone. If you ask me if there's kids in the neighborhood, I'll tell you to look in the backyards to see if they see any evidence of that. I can't tell you if there's a certain type of church down the street. I can't do anything to discriminate, redline, or lead you in or away from a neighborhood. I also, included in that, means I cannot discriminate against sexual predators. They're a protected class, and we cannot discriminate against them. So if it's important to you to know if there are any sexual predators who live in this area before you make an offer, you can either call the Minnesota Department of Corrections or go on the Department of Corrections website. All right, so that one's quick and easy, and you need to do that for both buyers and sellers. So showing you just some functionality now of Instanet, you'll utilize this icon up here in the top left a lot. It says File, and you'll drop down, and in this case, we're going to go down to Save and Exit, and I'll show you some other things when we get to the next form. But now when we go to the buyer representation contract, this one gets to be a little bit trickier. This is harder to explain, but very, very important to explain. So I do encourage you, read all of these. We have recordings of these. You can go through and watch them. Depending on the personality type of your buyer, you're going to either want to go through it in extreme detail, or you're going to want to summarize it. And if I have the chance to see you guys in person sometime soon, Christine's already heard this, but I have a personality profile that I refer to as Bolt. And I say that there are 4 different types of personalities. There's either bulls, who are very direct and very concise. They know what they want and they want it right now. There's owls, who are very analytical. They want to read every line. They believe everyone might be trying to pull the wool over their eyes. They want to be very cautious. There's lambs, who they kind of don't believe they deserve anything in the world. So they are just very, very careful about, gosh, I'm not sure I deserve this. I'm not sure I'm ready for this. And then there's tigers, and some people would say I'm a little bit of a tiger personality in that I'm excited. This works for me right now. Let's do it. Let's jump on it right now. And that probably is a little bit more of the bull personality as well, where we don't necessarily want all the details. We just want to know someone's taking care of us. And the acronym for that is BOLT. So it is widely known in sales, as you establish rapport, that you want to try to mirror the personality type of the person that you're selling to or that you're working with. So you need to try to temper your own personality, and you need to very strongly take into consideration or try to get to know the personality type of your buyer. And then you'll want to talk through these forms based on that cadence and based on that style. But for the purpose of education, to help you guys understand all of these lines today, I'm going to be going through it as if I'm an owl, which I'm not, and as if you're an owl, which is what's going to cause this to be pretty boring because most realtors are not owls. So we'll talk about that, like I said, sometime if we have the chance to be together, but just a quick summary of it. So you'll need to put the buyer's name and the date that you are filling out this buyer representation contract. Keller Williams Preferred Realty is automatically filled in here for you. And then you'll also want to put in the date at which the contract starts. Now, I get this question occasionally. Let's say that you showed a house to them on July 6th, but you're not actually filling out this paperwork until September 14th. It is okay to say that this contract started back then and that the contract end date is whatever date you choose here. But you do want to make sure and sign it and have the contract dated the date that you're actually talking through it and having them sign the paperwork. Most realtors that I see here at Keller Williams Preferred Realty will have their buyer representation contracts last for a full year. I think that's a good idea. But if you're working with an owl, if you're working with a real analytical buyer, there's a possibility that they may say to you, oh, no. If I haven't found a house within a year, that means you're not doing a good job for me. I am not comfortable with that. I'm going to have this buyer representation contract be as short as possible. So you really can choose any date that you want here. You should know that once the contract ends, that they are no longer under contract with you or Keller Williams Preferred Realty. However, if you have a purchase agreement that you've entered into, that purchase agreement supersedes this buyer rep contract and you don't need to extend it. So let's say you make an offer on something, it's going to be closing on January 20th. You don't need to change this buyer rep contract. This is a contract between you and the buyer. It gives the broker's obligations and it also gives the buyer's obligations to you. It talks about some of the specifics, like, for example, what the compensation is. You can ask that the buyer pay a retainer fee for your time and efforts. I've never ever seen that in 21 years or in the hundreds of transactions that I have audited here. So most likely you're going to be putting in a 0. However, you do need to let them know it is law that you need to disclose to them how you are paid for the work that you're doing in this transaction. So you will fill in here that you're being paid 2.7% of the sales price and that you are also receiving a $399 additional commission, which we call the brokerage administrative fee. That's a flat fee on every transaction. Now, you may be paid less commission, you may be paid more commission, and we can talk about how you'll negotiate that with your buyers at another time. But for the purpose of today, just fill in 2.7% here. You'll also need to let them know that if for some reason your contract expires or you decide to cancel the contract, that you do have the ability, or we do as a brokerage and you as a realtor, to put them on what's called a protected list. Meaning if you procured the cause, if you sent them the email that excited them about the listing, you took them to the home and you showed it, you procured their interest in the property. And even if they bought it from a different realtor at another time after, you still are, or we are as the brokerage, entitled to commission. So as it says here, it cannot exceed 6 months. You can choose any amount of days that you want to put in here. I try to fill in the 6 months, 180 days, but if you're working with a real analytical, an owl or something, you'd probably put in, 7 days, 30 days, something shorter. Any questions about that protected list? I know I've had quite a few questions on that in the past.
Oh,
I do have a question. So, okay, up on line, was it line 7 where we pick the timeline? That is how long the contract is valid for, you said?
Correct.
Okay, and so you usually do that for 1 year?
Correct.
Okay, so then that just means, hey, I'm representing you and I'm your real estate agent for this timeline?
Exactly. For any property that you buy, but I'm your realtor and you're my client. You can't engage with any other realtor.
Okay, so then you go back down to line 34 with 180 days. So let's say a year has passed and you still haven't found them a home and they haven't filled out a purchase agreement or made any offers and it's about to expire. Does line 34 say now on the last day of the expiration of this contract, from now to 180 days, that's when it's talking about the protected buyer list.
No, if your contract has expired, you'd need to fill out a new contract or extend this contract.
Okay.
Applies to is if for some reason they go and purchase a home that they saw with you within that last year, but they buy it from another realtor.
Oh, within the timeline of the contract, you mean within that year?
Yep, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. It's to protect you and your efforts. There's most of the things in these contracts are really protecting the client, the buyer, but this is something that really protects you.
Okay.
On line 2,
Yeah.
I don't have the spot, or I'm sorry, line, not 2, it would be 30, number 2. I don't have the part where it says plus the commission. It's
Oh,
not
I'm
in here.
so glad you brought that up. There are a couple different versions of this buyer representation contract, and we are working on, there was a forms update this summer. We are working on trying to streamline this. But in the meantime, you do have to disclose this. So you'll go all the way down to the bottom here in the other section, and you'll just type something like, and you know how well my fingers are angled on this keyboard, but you'll type something like, buyer understands a one-time brokerage compensation of $399 shall be paid as a part of closing costs upon successful closing.
Why did they take that out?
It's something that it's kind of long to explain. I'll explain it to you
Okay.
another time. But we are working on getting it back in. I just need to work with Sammy on it.
Okay.
It definitely should be there. All right, so you're going to let this buyer know that the general nature of the property that they are purchasing is most likely going to be this residential personal home. But we, in educating you here, recommend that you check all of these boxes because there's really no harm to it. So if they get a wild hair and they decide to buy an empty lot and build a house, or if they won the lottery and they decided to buy an investment property, at least still you're covered in representing them in all of that. So we just recommend checking all of those boxes. You do need to let them know that as a licensed realtor, you are an expert in real estate, but you are not a lawyer, you're not an accountant. There's a lot of things that you are not an expert in. And one of those things is title closing. So you'll help them prepare all the documents. Their loan officer will help them prepare all the mortgage documents. And then there is a representative at a company called a title company. And we have a lot of relationships with title closers like that. So as a convenience to the buyer, we would love to arrange for a qualified closing agent to conduct the closing. It's funny because I will check this box on line 66. We need to have them initial there. Those initials get missed, I'd say maybe 20% of the time. So keep an eye out for that when you're doing the signing. But when we get to the spot, usually people will just be like, yep, that's what I'm hiring you for. I want you to coordinate all the details. And occasionally the husband and wife will look at one another and they'll be like, oh, that's right. Aunt Susie's a title closer. She always told me that if I was gonna buy a house that she would want to do the closing for me. Or, oh, you know, my cousin's an attorney and I know that he closes a lot of houses in his practice in his office. So 66 will be the standard, 77 is rare and unusual, but you do have to give them the option, which is why it's a checkbox with an initial right here.
So line 67 is only if they decide to choose their own.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. They need to acknowledge that the real estate commission that they are responsible for ultimately comes from the seller, and I'll get to that next, but they have to also understand that there are additional costs to closing on a home. So there are close that they have to pay to the mortgage company. There's probably fees that they have to pay to an insurance company or association. They may choose to pay for a home inspector. So there are additional costs outside of this real estate transaction that they may need to have money saved for. They also need to acknowledge that if they are buying a home from someone who is a foreign investor, someone who is not a United States citizen, they need to seek appropriate legal and tax advice. And I'll show you where the seller is going to disclose whether they are or not. So this isn't something for them to worry about, but it is something for you guys to be educated on, that if a buyer closes on a property that's owned by a non-US citizen and the non-US citizen doesn't pay their appropriate taxes, your buyer has to, and that would be really ugly. Knock on wood, I've never known anyone who's had to do that, but there is a possibility. As a buyer, they may choose to have an inspection done on the home. They also may choose to put a warranty on the home, and that kind of falls into this additional cost area. That's why these three are all grouped together. If you're talking with a bull, I almost don't even talk about these things because they will just say wah, 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 wah. But if you're talking with someone who's very analytical, or maybe they've reviewed the forms and they ask questions of you after they've reviewed them, I want you to feel comfortable with what these sections are about. So, as we talked about when we reviewed the agency relationships, I let you know that I am representing you as just a buyer's broker, but it is occasionally a possibility that you may want to see a listed that's represented by my brokerage. So you need to give me permission, or you need to agree to allow dual agency to be existing in a transaction. And if they agree, then they would check here and you would have them sign here. If not, of course, you just need to check the bottom, but we do still want them to sign that section. You'll go on to talk with them about, you have to understand that there may be other buyers who also want to make offers on properties that I'm showing. So as a busy realtor, there may be other people who are looking at the same houses that you and I are. We both have to understand that you may have had relationships with other real estate companies, that we can terminate this contract by either canceling it or at the time that it expires, and it has to be done mutually. Both you and I have to agree to it. We've already talked about how I cannot discriminate against predatory offenders and how they need to understand that they need to go to the website there to look it up. This entire agreement is just one page in a grouping of documents that are going to constitute our contract. So we need to be aware that you need to have all the forms to create the entire agreement. When we're signing documents and representing you as a buyer, electronic signatures are just as valid. And also by signing this agreement, you're saying that you understand that I am going to need to be calling you, emailing you, texting you, occasionally faxing you maybe, or calling you on the phone or delivering something by mail, but you've given me consent to communicate with you. So page 4 is the signing page, and this is where you're going to put in this terminology. I'm going to hold here for a little while if you guys want to copy that down, where you're going to put in the terminology about the $3.99 brokerage additional commission. I called it compensation, but it's commission. And then I do highly encourage you to be as thorough as you possibly can on all these forms. These are probably people that you've met in in an open house, or maybe, they were a referral from a friend. This is the perfect opportunity to say, hey, I don't think I've ever gotten your full mailing address, or, we've only ever texted. I should be sure to get your email address as well. And I need to do that as well for my brokerage, because if something were to happen to me in case of an emergency, this is the first form that my brokerage would go to find out your contact information. Now, we do ask it on forms a few different times, so I'm okay with it not being filled in every time, but try to have at least one form with each client filled out with their thorough mailing address, phone number, and email. Now, one thing that I failed to do, and I should have done more so up here, is there is a feature up here where you're going to go into File and you're going to go to Save. You can save it as a PDF if you need to send the document out somewhere and whatnot, but be sure to save this every now and then. You're going through and putting in a lot of information. You're taking a lot of time. Every few pages, just remember to go down here and click Save. But now that we're done with it, we're going to go down to File, Save, and Exit. So the next form is a really, really cool form. Actually, I'm excited about this when I talk with both buyers and sellers, because I let them know when working at Keller Williams Preferred Realty, it is such a professional real estate company, and they are so thorough They dot all their I's, they cross all their T's, and they have found through the years that there's 2 pages worth of additional information that they want you to have a heads up on. We're just putting these as seeds in the back of your mind so that when we bring them up again in the future, it's not the first time that you're hearing it. So they want you to, they're giving you this additional disclosure, and they want you to understand that before making an offer on a home as a buyer, you are going to want to review the seller's disclosure statement. It's a require of a seller to disclose all material facts that they know about a property. You're not going to want to be reviewing the disclosure and making the offer all at the same time. That's stressful and a lot to take on. So be sure to always ask me for a property disclosure statement if it's a property you're thinking of making an offer on. Keller Williams also wants you to know that there are a lot of different products and services available in the marketplace that can help you as you make a decision on the home, or that can help you be really comfortable in your home, that they are elected items. You do not need to do a home inspection. You do not need to have a warranty program, but we do have a lot of names and contact information for home inspectors and home warranties that you can look into if you wish. So it's a good idea to study up on that before you make an offer. We do need to let you know, especially in today's marketplace, it is going to be highly likely that when you make your first offer on a house, that there will probably be other offers on the house at the same time. The thing of it is, in a multiple offer situation, there's, it's a little bit like a game of Texas Hold'em. It's a little bit like a game of cards. The seller does not have to disclose whether or not they have another offer, and they certainly are very unlikely going to disclose what the price or the terms of that other offer is. So you do just kind of have to play a game of hit or miss as the buyer. But again, remembering both buyers and sellers fill out this form, we have to get permission from the seller to divulge even the existence of an additional offer. So that's where it comes down to, let's take our buyer hat off and put our seller hat on. And where I said, get used to the terminology, my sellers have given me permission to share this with you. So that would be where you're on the phone as a buyer's agent and you're saying, hey, Mr. Seller's agent, my clients would like to make an offer. Can you let me know, are there any other offers on this property? They would say either yes, there are, or no, my seller has not given me permission to do that. And then as the buyers, they have to understand they're going to be frustrated with you, but it's not your fault. It doesn't have anything to do with you. You just have to operate under the kind of the standards that the seller is setting. You also have to understand, if you make an offer on a home that's a part of an association, there's going to be fees to that, there's going to be rules to that, and there's probably going to be a little extra expense as you prepare for closing on it. And don't be surprised, there's a lot of single family home neighborhoods now that are a part of an association. Out in the country, 10 homes, each on 5 acres. They may have a shared well, they may have a shared septic. It may be as basic as they just have a monument as you drive into the neighborhood, and they have to have insurance and lawn care on that. Of course, as you guys can expect, if you're a part of a townhome, if you're a part of a condo, that's assumed that there's a neighborhood association, but be keeping an eye out for these associations that are sometimes kind of unexpected. There's a section that starts here on the first page, and we're working on revising this too, but it starts here on the first page, and then it actually talks about a couple random things, and then it goes down here to talk about it again. So I would suggest you try to get in the habit of saying, you may be purchasing this home as a tax-deferred exchange. You may have capital gains that you're then trying to transfer into this new home that I'm helping you purchase. And if that's the case, you do absolutely have to consult with a professional 1031 exchange company. I can help you doing the contract, but you're going to need to have someone to help you do that. If they're not doing a 1031 exchange, do not spend a lot of time on this. It's not worth explaining. It's confusing. But if there's a situation where they're buying a house that's listed by someone who's going through a 1031 exchange, then you'd want to pull this form back out and make sure that they better understand it. So again, like I had touched on at the very beginning of the form, our area of expertise is that we are highly trained in the field of real estate and marketing real estate, but we are not necessarily experts in construction, in accounting and tax, in appraisal and property tax value evaluation. We're not lawyers, we're not environmentalists, we're not title closers. So there are things that we may need to refer you to, and we can give you a list of those trusted providers. Minnesota state statute, so the law requires that every single family dwelling have an operational carbon monoxide alarm installed within 10 feet of each room that is used for sleeping purposes. So as they are out touring houses, they need to understand it is the seller's responsibility to put those carbon monoxide alarms in the appropriate places. It's also really, really important. These are probably my two favorites. We are going to work to find you a new house, and you guys are going to pick a closing date that works well for you. But there are so many moving parts to assure that that closing date can happen. So you need to have grace, you need to have patience, you need to understand there may be an instance where your closing date is going to be delayed. And we don't ever, as their realtors, want them to come back and say, you never told me this could happen. I've already, my parents have taken time off work and all of my friends are coming over to help me unpack and I've hired the moving company and how am I going to change all of this? They're probably going to say that to you anyway, but you can pull this form back out and you can say, hey, we recommended that you keep this as kind of a gray area. We're going to do everything we can to close your house as planned, but there are some unforeseen circumstances that may prevent us from doing that. We also want to remind them that prior to closing on their house, whatever the closing date is, they are entitled and should take advantage of what's called a final walkthrough. We are going to schedule it with them. They're either going to do it the day before closing or ideally the morning of closing. And it's really important that they do that because if they find something there that isn't in the condition in which the offer was made, they do not need to close that day. Now they'll be faced with a hard decision whether or not they want to close that day, but they need to understand the condition that they see the house on the day of closing is the condition that they agreed to buy the house. So if all of a sudden, the refrigerator isn't working and they agree to close, the seller isn't technically responsible for giving them a refrigerator in working order. Now, you can better believe that's going to be a legal battle, and they're going to battle that out. But the truth is, they close on it and they buy the house in its current condition. So there's a section for buyers to sign, a section for sellers to sign. You don't need to have your buyer and the seller of the home they choose sign it. You only need to have the seller of a Keller Williams preferred listing realty sell it and the buyer of a Keller Williams. I do really want you to put the property address in here and write your name on it. I see this as kind of a sloppy thing. A lot of times the property address isn't in there and the salesperson's name isn't in there. Now I acknowledge you probably are making offers on a few different things. You don't necessarily want to have them sign this every time. That's okay, but at least put your name in there. So we'll go down to save and exit.
Hey, Melissa,
Go right ahead.
for the bottom line in the last form, the brokerage additional disclosures. Yeah. So you said we have to have both the sellers and the buyers sign this. So if we're the buyer's agent and we have our buyers sign it, do we then need to send this form over to the listing agent or the seller's agent and have them sign it?
No, you do not.
Oh, okay, so just one
Correct.
signature? Okay.
Yep, you're just going to be using this with whomever you represent, but
Okay.
it's dual disclosure. It's dual information that applies to both our Keller Williams preferred sellers and those of the buyers.
Okay. Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. I'm glad you asked. The next form is this affiliated business disclosure. So have you ever heard on a TV commercial or maybe when you bought a car, they let you know that the finance company and also the sales company of the vehicle were affiliated, and then, oh, by the way, also we're affiliated with the warranty company and this, that, and the other thing. That's because it is law that any person who has ownership in multiple companies where the companies and the consumer may work together, you need to be disclosed, you need to be informed, you need to be aware. So this is an affiliated business arrangement disclosure statement that says Keller Williams Preferred Realty, its legal name is actually Lakeville Holdings LLC, and it is owned by a group of owners. Some of those owners, but not all, have ownership interest in Minnesota Title, the title company that the house may close at, New American Funding, the mortgage company that they may choose to do their mortgage with, or Keller Mortgage that they may choose to do their mortgage with. It's convenient for you right here that it says you are not required to use any of these providers It is not an obligation, but whether you agree to it or not, you have to sign here saying that we understand we have the right to select our own provider. All right, that one's an easy breezy form. So we are getting into the nuts and bolts now of the purchase agreement. Those first 5 documents that I went over are the buyer representation forms. So if you guys decide to do just the buyer rep form with someone coming up, you can use just that section in the wizard without having to go all the way through the tutorial on all of these forms. And then likewise, you wouldn't have these buyer rep forms if you were just filling out a purchase agreement with someone that you've done the buyer rep form previously. All right, so you have looked online, you've seen this townhouse on Liberty Circle, you've seen it looks real nice, your client's real interested in it. I highly recommend when you are going to the house, when you are going to do the showing, print this out and just bring it with you. This is the personal property agreement. I know it seems a little out of order and it seems a little weird, but anything that is attached to the property is considered real property. Anything that is not attached to the property is not. So for example, people may wonder, are these blinds included? Are these curtain rods included? Is that mirror included? Are those drapes included? Is this little thing over the front door included? Now, it is my high suggestion to you that it is better to over document than under document, because I have found myself walking through a final walkthrough at closing too many times, and someone is nearly in tears saying, oh my gosh, those drapes just matched perfectly with my mother's, special rug that we were going to put in the front door. Why are the drapes not here? And then I'm embarrassed because I was working too quickly. I didn't clarify it with the seller. The sellers took these great shelves that we were going to put our baby pictures on, or our diploma or whatever. It does not hurt to over document rather than under document. So the personal property agreement makes sure and clarifies in the PA, you'll see that all the personal property is listed, but this is additional property. So this would be things like, well, those things that I said, or common things that come up like the trampoline or the play set in the backyard. Just over document rather than under document here. You'll put in the date that you're making the offer, you'll put in the property address, you'll put in the seller's name, you'll put in the buyer's names, and then the buyer will sign as a part of their offer. The seller will either sign agreeing, yep, we'll leave all that stuff, garage shelves, toy box in the basement bedroom, that kind of thing, or they'll counter back saying, oh, heck no, you can't have all of that stuff. But I can't impress upon you enough how important it is to try to write out everything in detail. And you can go back and you can look at the pictures to try to refresh your memory if you haven't done this while walking through with your client, but the pictures, they just don't always show everything. So make sure you get on the same page with your buyer about that. It's also of value to go through this document with your buyers. Now, keep in mind, this is a form that's put out by the Department of Housing and Urban Development. This is not put out by the Minnesota Association of Realtors. So it's not one of our standard forms, but we do include it in our standard packet because it's really good education, especially for a first-time home buyer. It lets them know, and the reason that HUD, Department of Housing, wants them to sign it is it clarifies what's the difference between a home inspection and a home appraisal. This is very, very confusing for a lot of people, but especially for first-time home buyers. A home inspection is something that you make your offer contingent upon. You pay a certified home inspector to conduct for you, and it's money out of pocket before you've even gotten the house. You'll spend roughly $600 to have this home inspection, but it helps you evaluate the condition of the home more so than just what you've seen at first glance on your first or second showing. Then it's letting you know that the appraisal is not the home inspection and it doesn't replace an inspection. So if your buyer is saying, like, to be competitive, I'm going to have to tell the seller, nope, I'm waiving my home inspection. I don't need a home inspection. Well, then the appraisal is not going to take the place of that. Your mortgage company is going to conduct an appraisal, which you also pay for, but it's paid later in the process. You pay for it as part of your closing costs typically. The mortgage company is going to send out an appraiser, and the Federal Housing Administration, FHA, if they're doing an FHA loan, they have certain strict conditions as well as VA, the veteran loan that some people might qualify for. So the appraisal is not the same as the home inspection. It's done to conduct a evaluation of the home, and it's also done to make sure that the home is safe and habitable, but it's not as detailed as a home inspection. What's cool about this form, and the reason I think it's valuable to have in your packet, is this is really good education. And again, it's not a contract, but it's just saying, yep, we as your buyers understand this. We understand it is going to be at our sole discretion to get a home inspection or not. And if they choose not to do a home inspection early on in that process, then it's really, really valuable to have this signed, because that's not them just saying like, oh, I'm in a rush, let's skip the home inspection. That's them saying, yep, I've received all this information, it came from the government, and I'm signing it. Any questions about it? Very good. I think
Hey, Melissa.
Yeah.
Hey, sorry I'm asking so many questions here.
Sure.
So for the last form that we were looking at, I think it was the personal property agreement form. That form, are we doing that form only in addition to personal property? So like on the purchase agreement, if you wanted like a hot tub included or a trampoline, then you would fill that out in the PA. Is this form always going to also be filled out with the purchase agreement, or is this only in addition to when you find out afterwards that you want to include different property?
I recommend using it instead of the PA.
Okay.
And the primary reason is when you get a mortgage, your mortgage has to be underwritten by someone called an underwriter, and they go through it with a fine-tooth comb. And if there's something written into the purchase agreement for real estate that's not actually real estate, that underwriter may flag it and may complicate the deal later, saying, oh, you got to take this out, you can't transact that as a part of this appraised value, so use this instead.
Okay.
So when you make an
Great
offer
question.
on a house, you would send the purchase agreement and this to
Yes.
the seller?
Yeah.
Okay.
Exactly. And if you're representing the seller and they don't have a personal property agreement, you can almost say, yippee skippy, this is going to be easier for us. We can take and leave whatever we want as sellers. So really it's most important for you to pay attention to as a buyer. If you have an offer that comes through on a property you're selling and it doesn't have a personal property agreement, that's really not a problem. But to represent the very best interests of your buyers, you should include a personal property agreement. Cool? All right, we are going to go into the purchase agreement and then all the supplemental documents. And if it's okay, I'm going to suggest we take a little like 4 or 5 minute break. I'm going to get some water, run to the ladies' room. That way you guys can return a call or check your email or whatever you need.
Perfect. Thanks.
Sound good? Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah. All right, I'll be right back. I need to run that now. Good. All right, guys, I'm back. Everyone else back?
Yes.
Okay, good. All right, so we are gonna get started on the purchase agreement. It's a lot of pages, so bear with me. You want to put in the date that you're making the offer, and you'll also want to put in the buyer's legal names. Now, this purchase agreement is going to go to the mortgage company and the title company. So if they want to go into title with their middle names, with their middle initials, if it happens to be they're buying it as a corporation or a trust, it should all be properly written in here. The price of the house that they're going to be making an offer at is going to be pre-decided by you guys as you know, as you're leading up to filling out this form. So this house is listed at 245, roughly 246, and it is customary to provide earnest money along with your offer in roughly 1% of the sales price of the home. So if this is a $250,000 house, you would likely say that you want your earnest money to be roughly $2,500. Now, the more earnest money that you provide, the more sort of solid that you seem as a buyer, and the more desirable your offer may be seen by the seller. But you don't have to break the bank here, because this money does literally come out of the buyer's bank account. It goes into the trust account of the listing brokerage or some other way that you've identified it here, but it's most commonly goes to the listing brokerage. And so a lot of people don't want to tie up, you know, $50,000, for example, on something like this. Now, as I audit files, I have seen that. I have seen really high amounts of earnest money, and that usually means that's a buyer who's really, really highly motivated. So you'll put in here just whatever amount of earnest money you and the buyers decide. It's kind of a tricky thing to talk about with them right away within these first few lines of the offer. But you do need to talk about it with them, and they do need to decide for themselves what they want to do. They'll look to you for your advice, and that's where we say the 1% is kind of industry standard.
The earnest money goes towards closing costs, right? The
Yeah.
buyer's closing costs?
The earnest money is actually a partial payment of their down payment.
Okay.
It could go towards their closing costs, it could go towards their down payment, but it doesn't go for nothing. It goes as an actual deposit, or actual partial payment towards what their money that they have to bring on closing date is.
Okay.
If you are working through the wizard, you'll see that the street address, the city, the county, that's all automatically populated in, which is really kind of nice. The legal description is automatically populated in, and then this is the personal property that you were referencing, actually. So it lists out a lot of things here, and it gets very nitty gritty, like the garden bulbs, the trees, the irrigation system, the shed, the storm door, the screens, the thermostat, the doorbell. So really almost everything should be listed out here. If there's something really ugly there that you don't want, like let's say there's a, you know, an old pop-up camper behind the shed that you don't want, you should write in here things that you do want to be sure that they have excluded as well. Maybe there's something old and grungy in the basement that looks like really hard to move out, or here's a common one, pool tables. Do you want the pool table to be left, or do you want the pool table to be removed? It's kind of expensive to remove those things if you don't want it. Make sense?
So if it's already included here, you don't need to include it in the personal property agreement.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay, but if it's not, then you would fill out the personal property agreement.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, that's where, you know, that's where things like that shelf that we saw in the office can be really unsure, you know, like, I don't know, do they plan to leave that? Was that a decorator thing? Is it firmly mounted into the wall? It talks about shelving here, but does it say the beautiful decorative shelf in the office? No, so I highly recommend writing it down in the personal property so that it's not taken, and then you have a buyer who's already nervous on closing date and then crushed about having to replace something that they were excited about. Cool?
Nice. Thank you.
Welcome. You'll put in here the offer price. So we're offering to buy this townhouse for 200,000, and we're letting them know that we are obtaining a mortgage, that we're going to be putting 10% down and financing 90% of it. We'll talk a little bit about contract for deed. We'll just touch on that. That's really rare. It's also very rare to assume a loan, so you'll just leave those 2 lines blank. And then you'll put in the preferred closing date, whatever you think is reasonable. I recommend talking with the buyer's mortgage company before you pick a closing date, because they'll tell you what their volume of closings are at a certain time. They'll say like, oh, no way can we still close this in September, or, you know, this person has some sort of judgment that they need to pay off, and so we need to go all the way to mid-November. But once you've talked with the mortgage company, you should also talk, of course, with the buyers, and then just take my tips of the trade. I don't recommend closing on a Monday. For whatever reason, it seems like documents aren't ready on time. People still have kind of that weekend fog. I don't recommend closing on a Friday because there's such a high volume of houses that close on a Friday. So if it's at all possible to try to close on a Tuesday, Wednesday, or Thursday mid-month, that's really the best, in my opinion. That's just my humble opinion. So with your wizard, the property address and the date and everything will all be automatically filled in. You'll be just going through the next few pages and doing a series of check marks. So you're going to let the seller know via this offer that this purchase agreement is contingent upon the buyer obtaining a mortgage. It will likely be a first mortgage and does not include any sort of grant or bond or loan assistance program. There are loan assistance programs that do exist, especially in rural areas where you can get like first-time home buyer assistance and things like that. If your buyer has gone through the classes and taken all the steps and they know that they qualify for that, then you do need to clarify it and specify it and disclose it by checking does here and writing in the details about it. But in most cases, you're going to say does not. You want to let the seller know via this offer what type of mortgage they're getting, because a conventional loan is the best possible loan that you can utilize. If you're doing a VA loan or an FHA loan, it may be less desirable to the seller because of those reasons that we talked about in terms of the VA and the FHA appraisals. People can buy homes with 0 money down, which means they'd get their earnest money back, or it would go towards their closing costs. People can buy homes with 0 money down, and that would be if it's in a rural area. And you can ask a loan officer for a map of what areas qualify as a rural area. Surprisingly, some of the areas just out past New Prague and just kind of down by Northfield and further south do actually qualify for that, which is good. Just a reminder, since this is such a long document, be going through and clicking on save as you go through here. It's very important on line 66 that you protect. This is a contingency that is protecting your buyer. It's very important that you protect them by letting the seller know that they're applying for a conventional mortgage that's going to be amortized monthly over a period of not more than, it's most often going to be 30 years here. Sometimes you may see 15 years or 10 years, but then you also need to protect them by saying that they shall not have an interest rate any more than a certain percent. And the reason you want to do this, like some people would argue that you can just write in market rate here, and that you may have to do if you're in multiple offer situation and you need to make your offer look as good and as competitive as possible. But to truly protect your buyer, interest rates change almost, daily and almost multiple times a day. And so if interest rates between the time that they made the offer and the time that they close on it increase by 1%, that could increase their payment by hundreds of dollars. So you want to protect them and say, hey, if this interest rate goes above 4%, I know that my client cannot afford it anymore. And then the purchase agreement would be able to be canceled very easily. Does that make sense?
So I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
So I heard from the PC class that if we have a buyer who has an interest rate that's locked in at say like 3%, we should always go up 1% or 2%. Yes. Just in case. And that way, if the market changes and for some reason it just goes crazy and it goes up to 5%, then they're able to then cancel this purchase agreement.
Understood it perfectly.
Exactly. Okay, so should we put market rate or should we just do?
No, please don't put market rate. I see that,
Never. Okay.
but please avoid doing that.
Okay. So just do like a percent or so up from what they were approved for.
Right, exactly.
Okay. Do you have to ask them if that's okay with them to do that?
Yes, yep,
Okay.
yep. You'll want to describe to them that this is a protection to them and that we are protecting them so they would not be obligated to buy this home if they can no longer afford it due to an increase in interest rate. So therefore, the interest rate you're talking with your mortgage company about right now is 3.25%. I'm going to say that you would not agree to buy this home if it increased to 3.5. I'm going to recommend 4%, and then this would be a discussion with them, and they would tell you what number they want to put in there.
Okay, perfect.
Good. You are also letting the seller know via this purchase agreement that if for some reason they cannot obtain the financing specified in this purchase agreement, that the buyer and seller without argument would mutually sign a cancellation and that the earnest money would be refunded to the buyer. Now, keep in mind, this may not be most appealing to a seller. So there may be some changes that you need to make here that are case specific, but what I'm going to have you check right now for your template is what is going to protect the buyer the most, assuming it's a balanced market. So to protect the buyer the most, we're going to say that if they cannot secure the financing, a cancellation would be signed and the earnest money would be refunded. There's another option that you may want to do if you want to make your offer more appealing, and that would be that you would tell the seller you're going to provide them a written statement from the mortgage company, and it goes on to define the written statement on or before a certain date. So if you were closing on September 30th, this would likely be September, let's see, 30th, this would likely be September 23rd, maybe let's call it the 24th, just to give an extra date. But to truly protect your buyer, this is what you're going to want to get in the habit of using. I just want you to understand what the other big box options are for.
So like if you knew that there was a house that was likely gonna have multiple offers, maybe you would talk about doing the forfeited, click on the forfeited to seller
Yes.
instead to make that offer look better.
Better, exactly.
Okay.
Yep, exactly.
Hey, Melissa. For the written statement, can you explain a little bit more about that and what that is?
Absolutely. A written statement is a one-page letter that comes from the buyer's mortgage company that states, this borrower has provided me everything that I need to qualify them for the loan. The property also has been appraised and it meets the appraised value and everything is done and ready. All the conditions have been cleared for this mortgage and they are fully approved to purchase the home.
Okay, is that very popular then? Pretty much every single time that's done?
No, it takes time, so a lender is not going to provide it unless, I mean, in most cases, a lender is not going to provide it unless this is required here.
Oh, okay.
You could always ask for one. It's a good idea to put it on your checklist and ask for one. But things move fast, and so most cases I don't see a written statement.
Okay.
Good question. We're also letting him know that they, as the buyer, have the right to lock in their interest rate at any time prior to closing. I really don't know, maybe because I haven't operated in an extremely volatile interest rate climate, but I don't know why you would choose line 16 in today's day and age. You'll just be checking that your buyer has the right to lock in on their interest rate at any time. Now, keeping in mind, since we've defined to them the difference between the home inspection and the appraisal, the lender is going to do an appraisal. Once the appraiser comes out, he may have some work order items that he asks the seller to do before closing. These would be things for an FHA or a VA buyer that are unsafe, that the mortgage company's appraiser considers to be something that needs to be improved in its condition. So we're letting the seller know that if the lender asks us to do any of that, the buyer isn't going to want to put money into a house that they don't own yet. So the seller has to agree to pay for that work. But then the buyer will agree to come back and pay the reinspection fee because the buyer's lender's appraiser is going to need to come back to make sure that the work is done. But this is, in essence, the buyer and the seller agreeing how they would handle this type of problem should the problem arise, and what their maximum amount out of pocket would be to have to repair those things. If you're utilizing an FHA mortgage, you also have, under the mortgage financing contingency clause, you also have this FHA escape clause. And that means you would write in whatever the sales price is that you made the offer at. And you would say, if for some reason this home doesn't appraise for $200,000, my buyer automatically has the right to cancel on this agreement. If it's not an FHA loan or a VA loan, then the buyer and the seller would negotiate on how they would handle a discrepancy in the appraisal amount. So you'll leave this blank and you'll only fill in the sales price if they're doing an FHA mortgage. There may be some lender processing fees related specifically to VA that the buyer is not allowed to pay. So we would have to tell the seller, if it's a VA loan and occasionally on an FHA, there are some closing fees, processing fees that can't be charged to the buyer. So we're asking you to pay those fees not to exceed, and you'll want to work closely with the mortgage company to find out the exact amount. Likewise, there's also a funding fee, which is kind of like a origination fee that's going to be paid for either by the buyer or the seller, added to the mortgage amount or at closing. So again, these are things to not worry yourself too much about right now, not until you've gotten a VA buyer. But then once you have, you're going to want to ask the lender and you're going to want to fill it out really thoroughly. Until then, you just leave it all blank.
Instead of leaving the lines blank, should we put like NA in the lines?
I don't think you need to.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't think you need to. That's a really good question, but I think you'd just spend too much time doing that. It's not valuable. It's not.
Okay.
You can either ask the seller to pay the buyer's closing costs, or the buyer can pay those out of pocket, which essentially just gets grouped together with their down payment. So either you ask the seller to pay closing costs by is and filling in a dollar amount or a percentage here, or you check that the seller is not going to pay their closing costs. And this is most common right now, that the seller is not going to pay closing costs. You also have an option to protect your buyers with a home inspection contingency. And you're then going to convey to the seller that the buyer does elect or decline to do a home inspection, and that this purchase agreement either is or is not contingent upon the home inspection. So they can elect to do a home inspection, but not have a contingency on it. So the inspection would just be for information purposes. But most people, if they elect to do a home inspection, are going to say that it is contingent upon it. The seller is either going to allow them to or not do any intrusive testing. And in most cases, you're going to say does not allow them to perform intrusive testing. That would be like cutting out a basement wall to see what the concrete foundation looks like behind it. And then you need to let them know how many days you're going to, and these are calendar days, after the date of final acceptance, that all the inspections are going to be conducted within. People are trying to do pretty quick home inspection contingencies right now, if they do them at all. But the truth is, the time frame that you put in here is when the inspection needs to be conducted. Then the home inspector will email you and the buyer the home inspection report, most often the next morning. That report kind of needs to be processed and digested. Then you need to take the time to write out an amendment, letting them know what items they are asking the seller to change, repair, fix up, and whatnot. And then they need to respond back to that. So it's not just the number of days that you're going to get there to do the home inspection. This is the total number of days that you're going to get there. Pitch your, pitch the seller what you want them to do, and then allow them to respond. So I recommend making that 10 calendar days. It can be any number of days that you want. If the buyer needs to sell a home in order to be able to purchase this new home, you would need to notify them of the sale of a buyer's property contingency. And if it's been listed already, or even if it's under contract already, you'll just use this middle section here, and you'll let them know the property address and the date that it's scheduled to close. But if they haven't even listed it yet, there's a separate one-page addendum that I'll talk you guys through today. And most often you're going to see that it's item number 3, where you're saying the buyer does not need to sell anything. They have the financial ability to perform on this purchase agreement without selling anything else. We go on to talk about real estate taxes and special assessments. So you'll have looked on the listing to see what the real estate taxes are and if there are any special assessments. So you'll want to go through here and say that most often the property taxes are going to be prorated, which means everything from the January 1st until the day before closing is paid for by the seller. Everything from the day of closing until the end of the year is paid for by the buyer. If you really want to sweeten your deal, you could choose some of these other options where you're saying that the buyer agrees to pay all the taxes and the seller agrees to pay none. I just don't see that very often. You'll want to look and see if the property is homesteaded or not homesteaded to select either between shall or shall not. In the state of Minnesota, you can own one property, and that property you can consider your homestead, and then they give you a slightly lower tax rate. So by comparison, let's say you own a home and a cabin. Your cabin would not be homesteaded, and therefore your property taxes would be slightly higher. So let's say you're representing a buyer, they're buying someone's cabin, but they're going to make it their primary residence. Well, this year, their property taxes would maybe be $2,800 because it is not homesteaded. We're pretending this is a no. And they know that next year, when they go in to have their property taxes there, their property taxes are going to be $2,400 because it will be homesteaded at that point. So you can ask the seller to pay the difference. This is really, really nitpicky. And so I'm going to just advise you that you should always check shall not here. If you get to a point where you're worrying about, $200 difference between the homestead taxes, you can come into my office and I can help you work through that. But for the most part, just click shall not. Also, for the most part, you're going to say that the seller shall always be obligated to pay any deferred real estate taxes or special assessments, any that are levied, any that are pending. But there may be some things where if you're buying a townhome and a townhome association has said, hey, we're thinking of replacing all the roofs. We haven't agreed to do it yet, but we're just talking about it. You've seen that in the association, the supplements and the association documents, which are down here. And you would say, hey, to sweeten my deal, I want you to know my buyer is going to be willing to assume any special assessments that may come up. But for the most part, you're going to check that the seller has not. You're also going to look to be sure that the seller has not received notice of any special improvements, and that would be listed in here as well. Additional provisions. So I'm going to give you this scenario. Let's say that you're making an offer on this townhome. I'm the listing agent of this townhome, and I've let you know that, hey, I want to let you know we had someone else who was going to buy this townhome. They ended up having to cancel because their financing fell through, or because they were relocated out of town, or because their mother just died and they don't have the mental wherewithal to do it. But you can make an offer on this purchase agreement or on this property, and we can execute it, but we all need to acknowledge I haven't received the cancellation yet from the former buyers. That's where this would apply. You would say that this purchase agreement is contingent upon the cancellation of a previously executed purchase agreement dated this. I expect to receive it back no later than this date. Likewise, if your buyer has made an offer on something else, then they were like, holy moly, I only kind of liked that, but now this just came on the market today. I like this one better. Send a cancellation into the first one, and let's make an offer on this other one. You would use this additional provision section for both of those reasons. Does that make sense?
Are you allowed to put in multiple offers for your client on different properties?
No, because
Just
one at a time, because all of those could be accepted, and then
okay.
you contract to buy multiple homes, of which I'm sure they didn't intend to do that, nor could they afford it.
Okay, so you have to wait then until it either gets accepted or declined, and then at that point, if it gets declined, you can move on to a different property.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
So wouldn't you just send them the cancellation versus going back into this original PA and having to check off these boxes? Because they would already have had this and accepted your offer, right?
Hey, Cassandra, I didn't know that you were on the call. I'm glad you joined.
Hey. Yeah.
Yes, of course, of course, of course. I mean, it is going to be in your very best interest to receive your buyer will have sent it over to receive a seller executed cancellation before you do anything else. But you do have to act obediently. So if they say to you, you know, it's 11:11 in the morning on my baptismal birthday and all the stars are aligning and this house just came on today and I know this is the perfect house for me. I need you to write up an offer for me right now. You have to do it, but if you haven't gotten the cancellation back, you need to make sure and notify here.
Okay.
So these are extreme circumstances. This is very rare. Just want you to understand from that OWL perspective what it's there for.
So do you just not fill it out then if there was no?
Exactly.
Okay, you just leave it blank.
Yep, exactly. Okay. Yep, and you can check is not, that this purchase agreement is not subject to a cancellation, or most people just leave it blank. You are then, by making this offer, asking the seller to provide for you warrantable, marketable title on the property via a warranty deed. If the seller has notified you that it's a trustee's deed or a personal representative's deed, if there's been like a death in the family or something like that, and it's a, you know, it's a group of family members that are selling it for someone else, or if it was a foreclosure, you receive a different type of deed, but in most cases, excuse me, pardon me.
Bless you.
You're going to receive a warranty deed. Excuse me. Going to the next page, we'll talk about possession. In most cases, the seller is going to give possession to the buyer immediately at closing, like literally at the time that the signing is done and all the wire transfers have been conducted and the mortgage company has approved the closing. But I really, really, really recommend that you use line 273 more often than not, because you can sweeten the deal to a seller a lot, and you can kind of even ease the moving process for the buyer if you say that you'll receive possession to the property 12 hours after closing. Maybe you want to say 24 hours after closing. Maybe you want to even say 72 hours after closing, 3 days. There is a risk to this. There certainly is a risk that something very bad may happen to the house in between the time of the closing and the time that they're taking possession. So there's no doubt about it, this is risky. It's maybe not for everyone, but I'm a tiger and I take big risks and I'm not afraid of that kind of thing. And if it gives me some time to, you know, allow the seller to get thoroughly moved out and the buyer, you know, more time, they've conducted the closing on day one, and then they're actually scheduling their big move on day two rather than trying to do them all in day one, I think it does provide for just a kind of a lower stress transaction. This also, lines 274 and 275 are really important and they're capitalized. Therefore, it is the seller's obligation to remove all debris and all personal property on this date of possession. So whether it's immediately after closing or slightly after, that means the garbage can, that means the stuff that they couldn't, you know, clean up in the basement. The seller really is not allowed to leave any of that stuff, any of that junk. The seller is also we're also letting the seller know that they are obligated to disconnect all electronics. So like their iNest camera and things like that. Now, I will tell you, as you go from lines 280 all the way to the very bottom, there aren't any more blanks that we need to fill in. And so these couple pages are tough. These are hard to talk through with people. They're even kind of hard for me to talk through with you guys right now. So I'm going to scan over them, but I highly recommend that you read them in detail. And then when you're talking through it with the buyer, just make sure that they understand, I'm going to be giving you a copy of this purchase agreement. You can read every line, but these are all really just some legal definitions that the Minnesota Association of Realtors wants you to understand and be notified about. These are all a part of your purchase agreement. And then depending on the personality type, I'll either outline, you know, maybe 1 per page or 3 per page, but you guys are going to go through and read these through in detail. For example, it is acknowledged by the buyer that the seller provided the information on the MLS And all of that, these measurements are approximate, that we as the real estate company and that they as the seller are not responsible for making the room bigger if when the buyer moves in, they can't fit their bed because the measurements on the listing were off. It also talks about how if there were some sort of natural disaster or problem that happened at the house between the time that we're executing this purchase agreement and the time that they're closing on the house, it would be the seller's responsibility to bring the home back up to its previous condition. And it is also the buyer's option that they can wait until it is done so, or they can cancel the agreement. Time is always of the essence. You can drag your feet on making an offer. You can drag your feet on responding to it. You can drag your feet on responding to a counter offer, but it's in everyone's best interest to work as quickly as possible. And time is of the essence. Days are calculated based on the definitions that are in all the documents. Business days are different from calendar days. This is how we would release the earnest money if the buyer and seller needed to cancel. And if either party just simply defaults on the purchase agreement, this is how it would go down. Talking again about predatory offenders and how we are not allowed to discriminate against them. And then we're also going to check here that the seller has either provided a copy of a seller's disclosure or a seller's disclosure alternative. If for some reason it's not here as a supplement to the purchase agreement, then you would want to be sure to write in this other section, a couple pages down here, you'd want to be sure to write seller to provide buyer with a complete copy of the seller's disclosure no later than, and you put a date in there. All right, so now we've gotten through that kind of boring stuff, and we are then going to just be back to a whole bunch of check boxes again. So we're checking that the home either is connected to city water and sewer, and then conversely, the seller either does or does not know of a subsurface sewage treatment. It's rare that it's connected to city water and sewer and it has a well or a septic system. Occasionally, it will have an old well that they're utilizing for lawn or something like that. But most often you'll say, yes, it's connected to city water and sewer, and no, it does not have a well and septic. And that is outlined here in the listing. It'll be over here in the structure information. So look closely for that. Your buyer will have the right to tell the seller whether they'd like to have a home warranty or not. And each time I do this and go over the purchase agreement, I chuckle a little bit because the way that I ask them if they'd like to have a home warranty or not is at this point and during the purchase agreement, their eyes are kind of glazing over. So I try to totally change the subject. I like change my posture. I move to turn to them, or if we're on the phone, it's a little bit harder. But I'll say, hey, when's the last time you guys bought a new TV? And they'll be like, oh, I'm awake now. What's going on? And they'll be like, oh yeah, we just, we got one last Christmas, or oh, we haven't had one in 30 years. And I'll say, well, when you bought that, did you elect to have a warranty on it or not? Like when you got to the checkout, they always ask, would you like to buy an extended warranty on this? And this will tell you a lot about a person. They'll look at one another and they'll start laughing and they'll be like, oh my gosh, he doesn't buy anything without a warranty. Or, they'll say like, oh no, I think those are such a crock. I think those are such a sham. So then you can, you've kind of changed things up, you've kind of lightened things up. So then you'll ask them, all right, well, in this case, you're buying a home rather than a TV, but you do have the right to purchase a home warranty. You can buy it for yourselves, or you can ask the seller to provide it. I think since you guys are kind of warranty people, I think it would give you good peace of mind to ask the seller to put a warranty on the home. And as we saw, that water heater is getting old. The furnace is new, but the air conditioner is really old. The dishwasher is really old. I think it might be nice for you to have a warranty paid for by the seller, and then they either say like, no, let's not mess it up with that, or yeah, I think that's a really great idea. But you've given them the choice here. You've already started talking about it back at the point where we did the KWPR additional disclosures. So this won't be a big shock to them. If they really are warranty people and they're interested in it, they'll probably say, well, like, okay, how exactly does it work and how much does it cost? And then you can provide them all that information. But for right now, just for the purpose of this class and education, that's a little summary on how I recommend moving through that section. Just a reminder here on agency, If the seller's agent is with a different brokerage altogether, they are the seller's agent and you are the buyer's agent. But if this is Sarah Anderson, who's representing Keller Williams Preferred Realty listed by her, then both of you are dual agents. Even though she's really working with the seller and you're really working with the buyer, you are both dual agents in that case. You would then go on to say that indeed dual agency does apply in this transaction and all buyers and sellers need to date. Or if it's dual agency does not apply in this transaction, no one needs to sign it. This is just a blank signing line if dual agency does not apply. Again, more definitions that go, roughly a page here. You can talk through this in detail if you're working with someone analytical, but in most of these cases, there's just really not even going to be anything to talk about. Except I do like to say, we're making an offer. This is not a fully and final accepted contract until both parties have signed and both parties have been delivered copies of the purchase agreement. And this entire agreement is going to be in writing. We're not going to have any verbal agreements. We're not going to have anything in text messages back and forth. And these are the additional addendums that are included making up this entire agreement. And I'll go ahead and have you guys sign down here. And again, we do have, I shouldn't have said again. I think that rolled off my tongue. I know what it was for. Again, we do bring up this foreign investor type of thing. So it's going to say in the seller's property disclosure whether they are or not a foreign person. You'll have reviewed the disclosure, your buyers will have reviewed the disclosure. It is very, very, very tempting to say, hey, I'm the buyer's agent, but I know the seller is not a foreign person. So I'm just going to check this to get it out of the way and have my buyers click sign here. However, we strongly encourage you not to, because as Greg Hartos famously says, just because someone says that they're single doesn't mean they're single until the divorce has been finalized. So you don't want to assume they're not a foreign person. You want to put the onus on them and let the seller check here that they are or are not a foreign person. So in an offer, you just have the buyer sign on this right side, but then looking at a purchase agreement when you get it back, for it to be a final purchase agreement, the sellers will have signed here. The sellers will have said they are likely not a foreign person. If there were any counter offers, you or the seller would have checked here that indicating there are. And then eventually there's going to be some sort of final acceptance date down there, and it's really important that that's included. Final acceptance date is what starts the calculation of dates on a lot of things. And so it's really important that even if it was the seller's responsibility to do all of those things, when I'm file auditing, I'm looking at those three really closely. Now, before I have them sign this arbitration agreement, I'm going to change through two arbitrations. So let's go to save and exit. So I'll bring this page forward then next, and I'll say, hey, I had you sign at the top, but before I have you sign at the bottom, I want to make sure and thoroughly explain arbitration to you. In the state of Minnesota, at the time that a buyer and seller are negotiating on a property sale, the state of Minnesota wants the buyer and seller to have agreed how a dispute would be handled should a dispute arise. It seems weird to have to agree to this ahead of time, but you're simply going to agree to arbitration or decline arbitration. Whether you agree or not doesn't matter. My brokerage does encourage me to agree to arbitration. Whether you and I agree to it, it doesn't matter, because the seller and the seller's realtor all have to agree to it. So this is what you need to know to be educated on arbitration. Let's just say you move into your house and you discover once you've moved in that your roof is leaking and you're very frustrated. It wasn't on the seller's disclosure, it wasn't in your home inspection, it wasn't anything that you ever noticed. But you have reason to believe from just investigation that you've done on your own that maybe the seller knew this was happening and maybe the seller should be responsible for it. It's not just the joys of home ownership. This is something that you think the seller fraudulently misrepresented. You can file an arbitration claim. It must be filed within 24 months after the date of closing. You can also take the seller to court. If you sign an agreement of arbitration, you give up your right to go to court for claims over $15,000. It would all have to be handled in arbitration. But the whole reason it exists is because it is believed that it is a non-biased, efficient way to handle these disputes. Once you filed a claim, and you do have to pay money for it, once you filed a claim, an arbitration date is set, an arbitrator is assigned, you would be at home, the sellers would have to come back home. I would be there as your buyer's representative, the realtor representing the seller would have to be there, any attorneys that anyone wants to get involved, and also the non-biased arbitrator are there. It's looked at on site, and it's decided right then and there. And it cannot be amended. It cannot be changed. It's binding arbitration. However it's ruled, it's ruled. It's more efficient because it's there. The alternative is you would hire an attorney, you would set a date, you would file a lawsuit. The hearing date would be set and assigned, and then you would show up, you'd sit in front of a judge who maybe knows something about roofs, maybe doesn't, and they would rule. But then, of course, if you weren't happy with the ruling, you could continue to amend it. So I'm not here to give you legal advice. I'm not here to tell you which is better. I'm only here to tell you that it exists because it is believed to be an efficient way to handle disputes should they arise. How do you guys feel about that? And then most people will say, well, I don't know, what do most of your people do? And I'll say, well, my brokerage does encourage me to sign it because they do think it's an efficient way of handling disputes. And so a lot of people that I work with do sign it, but not everyone. And they'll make the decision, they'll sign, and you'll go back to this form then, you'll go back to the purchase agreement, and you'll say, okay, so I understand your position, that's not a problem, whether it's for or against. You'll go all the way down to the very last page, to the very last page, to the very last section, and this says, all I'm doing is acknowledging that I've had the opportunity to review arbitration, not whether I agree or not. But this is just a check and balance to make sure that realtors talk about that arbitration form and that buyers and sellers say, yep, my realtor talked through it with me. Also included in the purchase agreement is this wire fraud alert. This does not need to be signed by sellers. It's only signed by buyers. And it talks about how there is indeed internet fraud. And sadly, I guess sellers can sign it too, but sadly, in the short time that I've worked here, there has been a wire fraud incident. And a buyer came to closing, thought she had wired her funds to her title company. It turns out she wired it to some scam artist, and she lost all of her money. She was able to close on the house like, a week or two later. She was able to file this complaint online, and I don't know yet whether she's gotten her money back, but it's really important that you have at least had this conversation with your buyers, that you have them sign it, and that when it comes very close to closing, as they're talking about the funds that they need to wire, that you're looking at it closely with them to make sure that the wiring instructions are indeed from a valid source.
Melissa,
Yes.
having to do with arbitration, what happens if, say, your buyers agree to do arbitration and they sign it, but then the sellers don't?
Then your buyers would have to acknowledge that should a dispute arise after closing, the only way they could handle it is by hiring an attorney.
Okay, so then okay. So they have to agree in order for it to be going to arbitration, then they both have to?
Yep, exactly.
Okay.
There's really good information about arbitration online too, so I do recommend you look like on the North Star MLS and also on the Association of Realtors. There's good pamphlets and packets on it.
Okay.
All right. Now, the rest of these documents are little addendums, amendments, additions to the purchase agreement that you're going to use, and you're going to use them in their offer. They don't necessarily all have to be agreed to. They're going to be situation specific. So let's say you're buying this townhouse. You are going to use this common interest community. Oops, I think I did the wrong one. Oops. Nope, sorry. I pulled up the wrong one. Oh, there we go. I was right there. I just clicked on the one below it. It's a lot of pages, it's a lot of detail, read through it, but it can be summarized very easily by explaining that when buying a home that's a part of a common interest community, and remember, it's those acreage neighborhoods and everything, to protect your buyer, they are entitled to receive all of the association documents, all of the financial statements of the association, to make sure that A, they can live within those rules and regulations, and B, to make sure that they can afford to live within that association. So if there's a pending lawsuit or something coming up, they may review these association documents and say like, holy moly, no, I can't afford to pay an additional $7,000 to have a new roof put on this townhome. I need to cancel. I now have more information on what I'm getting into and I need to cancel. So you'll want to be sure to write in here where you find the association information, which is, let's see, right here. It's under the general property information. You'll see the association management company name, what their association fee is, what their contact information is. So when making an offer, you'll write the name and the address and the phone number of the association. Actually, I think that might go in a different spot. But anyway, write that information in there so that your buyer understands it, that they understand they have the right to cancel and they would document that properly if necessary. And it goes on to define things. So the buyer needs to understand that they're going to pay monthly association fees, that the association should be accumulating reserves, but occasionally they need to do special assessment for things like that roof that I was talking about. There's warranty and exceptions, and then it goes on to outline some more state statutes. So again, read through that. It talks about how it's important that they've received a disclosure statement, or in these handful of cases, they don't need to receive a disclosure statement, but they'll sign it here as a part of their offer. It's a really long form for what I consider to be a really simple concept. But let's just say that if I was listing this house and I had put on here as a supplement, let's just say that I had already given them all that association information. They can actually say, hey, I'm making an offer, Melissa, on this townhome, and I do not need to be contingent upon reviewing of the association documents because you've already given them to me. So you could then instead use this, and you would use this 3 days after, and you would say, I have received a full property disclosure statement. It's dated this date, and I am choosing to waive the rest of the 10 days. Or maybe you're choosing to shorten the number of days down, but it's really important that you know that you cannot shorten it to any more than 3 days. You have to have 3 days after closing. You have to have held those association documents, reviewed them, and then use this form. All right? And this is just something that the buyer fills out. The seller doesn't need to execute it.
So this form didn't pop up. So would I need to go and add it then?
Yeah, perfect. Sorry about that. There may be some things that I have added that are not in the template. So it is called waiver of, where was that? Common interest community modification waiver of purchaser's rights. So to add that, you just click in the checkbox here, and then you just start searching. Just start typing, and that'll narrow the search. And then you'll be able to check at the box here and do add. Now, equally important in my opinion, because this is a CYA thing for you as a realtor, as soon as you receive those association documents, have your buyer sign receipt of this. There would be hardly anything worse than your buyer calls you 2 months after closing and says, I've been out walking my dog every day. I love this community, but I just got a nasty gram from the association telling me that the breed or the height or the weight of my dog are not authorized here and that I need to get rid of my pet. So don't be sloppy, don't be messy. Make sure you understand everything that they're getting within their association rules, and you'll check all these boxes once they have. It's either for a part of the association and or master association, which might be like if they're a part of the Trillium Cove development, which is a part of the Stone Mill Farms master plan community, that would be association versus master plan association. You'll also, because these signed copies go to the buyers, you'll also want to reiterate again, here's the management company, here's the contact, here's the website. You know, Christine, you here are receiving these documents. I've given them to you. You've signed a receipt of it. They will also sign receipt of something called a resale disclosure certificate, which is listed here, but that comes usually a couple weeks after they've reviewed all the association documents. So you'll have the chance to have them sign receipt twice. Most of the files that I audit, I just see people have them sign one or the other, and though that's okay, I really would like you guys to get started out on the right foot and have them sign both, because it covers your own, you know what. Okay, we talked about if they need to list their home in order to be able to buy a new home, you would use, or make an offer on the new home, you'd use this addendum to purchase agreement sale of buyer's property contingency. You reference the date that you made the offer and the property that they're making the offer on, and then you put in the buyer's current property, and you'd say either it is currently listed or will be listed within a certain number of days. It's going to be listed by you, I'm sure, but if it happens to be out of state and it's listed by, you know, Remax in Laguna Beach, California, you'll want to write that kind of thing out. And then this really just stays out there as a contingency that they have until they receive an executed purchase agreement on their house. And then it says to properly remove this contingency, the realtor who has their house listed needs to give to us, and then we need to give to this seller a valid purchase agreement. So you need to receive a true, valid, fully signed purchase agreement for the sale of that property to remove this. It says that you need to give it to them within a certain number of days. To be honest, I don't fully understand that. So let's just say to protect yourself, you could put in a week, you know, if you're busy and slow, but I don't see there any reason you couldn't, once you receive that purchase agreement, turn it right over to the other party. And then the seller has to sign this as well. Moving on, and you guys just jump in if you have questions, okay? Because these are all kind of one page, easy breezy ones. Get back to my spot here. It's important for you to remember and recognize the difference between an addendum and amendment. An amendment is used after the purchase agreement has been executed and you need to change something that you previously wrote. An addendum is something that you use if you're just saying, I want you to be notified of XYZ. So when you're making the offer, if you use an addendum, it might be something like, I need to notify you that the buyer is related to the buyer's real estate agent. For example, you always have to disclose that if you're related to a buyer or seller in a transaction. An amendment might be something like, all right, we're 2 weeks before closing, and I need to let you know that we are now adding the co-borrower, Melissa Johnson, to this purchase agreement. You're amending the original terms. Both of those have to be signed by buyer and seller in order for them to be executed. Once you've made your offer, the seller may respond back to you and say, you know what, absolutely everything about that offer makes perfect sense to me. It seems like a great deal. I just want to change the closing date. The closing date doesn't work for me. So you would write, you know, that seller would write in the new closing date, whatever their closing date preference was, and they would send this over to you. It would be signed only by the seller. Once you see it as a PDF, you'd present it to your buyer and you'd say, can you guys make this closing date work? And most likely they'll say, yep, absolutely, no problem. So then the buyers will sign it, and then it is your responsibility, whoever the second signer is, to type in the final acceptance date here. You can have a handful of counteroffers as buyers and sellers go back and forth with whatever terms they want to change. Some people write those changes right on the purchase agreement. The ideal preference is that they would all be on a counteroffer addendum like this. Okay. Prior to, and therefore I probably should have this up higher in here, but a rule changed, a form changed and a rule changed just this summer. So prior to that rule change, you just needed to have your buyer sign at some point prior to closing this disclosure statement to buyer. It's a compensation disclosure. You now are technically supposed to have them do this before they even make the offer. So you know what, I'm just gonna move it up here for my sake for the next time. Sorry to make you guys bear with me on this. Put it up by the personal property. what it states is that they, the buyer, have to acknowledge that your real estate brokerage, now do yourself a favor and make sure they know you don't get all this. Your brokerage receives 2.7% of the sales price, and it comes from the seller, it comes from the seller's broker. However, as previously discussed, as a part of the buyer's closing costs, they do have that one-time broker additional commission or brokerage compensation of $3.99. So that's why there's a definition of what's coming from the seller and what's coming from the buyer. Now, I'm just going to get really creative and say, let's say that this is a 2% listing on the MLS, but you have a listing contract with them that they agreed to pay you 2.7%. If you're comfortable with this, and I'm not, but some of you may be more assertive or more analytical than I am, you can tell the buyer, hey, as a part of your closing costs, you do have to make up that difference for me, and this is where you put it in, and this is where you would identify it. Any questions on that?
What is the name of this form again?
This is the compensation disclosure. And it is just signed by you. This is one of the forms that is signed by you, kind of like the buyer rep agreement. And it's also signed by them, but it doesn't have to go over to the seller. I mentioned that there might be an opportunity where you're asked to represent someone as a facilitator. And I'm pulling up now the buyer facilitator service agreement. I'm not going to talk through all of it. I'm going to scan it and I'm going to show you that it is almost identical to the buyer representation agreement. So it talks about, is there a retainer fee? What is the percent of compensation that you would receive? And what's the additional commission that the brokerage receives? That's, that $3.99, whether it's a facilitation or not. It asks, would they like to have us arrange the closing? It talks about foreign investors, talks about previous relationships and electronic signatures. So it's virtually identical, except that it says up here that the broker is only obligated to do these things for the buyer. They want us to show them information about properties. Do they want us to provide them with comparable sales so they can come up with a market value themselves? Do they want to physically show them properties? Now, if this is someone who's just buying their grandma's house, they probably don't need information about comparable properties. They maybe will want to see some comps. They don't need to do any showings because they can just knock on grandma's door. They want to learn a little bit about financing? Nah, they work at a mortgage company and they know that all on their own. Do they want us to provide the purchase agreement? Most likely they do. Do they want assistance in scheduling a closing? They probably don't, because if they already work at a mortgage company, they probably have one that they want to work with already themselves. And if there are any other additional services that they're asking you to provide. So that's really the only way a facilitation agreement is different than a buyer rep agreement. I'm guessing you have some questions on that?
Yeah, how do you decide the percentage, the compensation for the facilitator?
The minimum compensation is 2%.
Okay.
And we do have some people who represent grandma and the buyer, and they would charge 1% to grandma and 1% to the buyer.
Okay.
So ultimately, if you're just facilitating something where people have already put the deal together themselves, you could tell the seller, hey, you only have to pay 1%, and buyer, you have to pay 1%, or customarily, the seller will pay it all, and the buyer just acknowledges you're paid 2% on that.
Okay.
Good question, really good question. There's also an unusual type of financing that a seller could extend to a buyer, and it's not on the standard purchase agreement because it references contract for deed, but it's different than the FHA and the VA. There's a lot more to cover on that, and it's a few pages long here. So I'm just going to tell you, I'm not going to go through it with you right now. If you come upon a situation where a seller has notified you in financing terms that they do agree to, where is the financing terms? I don't know. That they do agree to contract for deed, and your buyer needs a contract for deed, we're going to work through this individually, and we also need to work through an attorney to have the contract for deed actually written. But as a part of your offer, you would say, hey, I noticed on your listing you said that contract for deed was a financing option. It's great for my buyer, and so this is just the contingency saying that the purchase is only going to take place if the contract for deed financing works out. This is important information about contract for deed. So you can read here, just kind of a one-page summary of it, and then the buyer needs to sign that saying that they understand what they're getting into. You remember in real estate class where they talked about how you have a bundle of rights? And what happens in a contract for deed is the buyer gets some of those rights, but the seller still keeps some of them as if they're a mortgage company, because a mortgage company has rights to your property too. That's pretty complex, but I just wanted to touch on it. One other thing, if your buyer is making an offer on a property that has a well and a septic system, you'll want to be sure to include this addendum to the purchase agreement. It's a separate contingency that allows the buyer to do a thorough analysis of the well and septic system there. The seller is also obligated to get to them a separate well and septic disclosure in addition to their property disclosure, but this is a protection that you'll want to use to your buyers that says, yep, it does have a subsurface sewage treatment system, that the seller agrees to provide an inspection of that and provide it to us. Yes, there is a well, and yes, the seller does agree to provide a water quality test. And that covers it. How's everyone doing? Are you bored out of your mind?
Good details.
Well, thank you. I know you're not going to be able to remember all that, but I hope if nothing else, your brain triggers a little bit when you get to some of those sections. Melissa told me to pay close attention to this. And then just a reminder, they're not all on there yet, but we are working on getting recordings just like this of each of these forms. So if when you're filling them out on your own, you need a little refresher, you can always go to the dashboard and get those. I'm curious, Cassandra, I'm so thankful that you came back in. I know that you've done lots of purchase agreements on your own, so it means a lot that you took a lot of time to do this. And Brett, you've probably heard plenty of them through your wife. Grace, are you planning to come on Saturday to the seller boot camp?
I'm debating whether I'm able to make it in person, but for sure I plan on coming on Zoom.
Okay, all right, cool. And everyone's welcome in person or on Zoom. It's a lot easier for me to talk when there's someone in the audience, and I like to kind of get to know you and establish rapport too. So if you can make it even just for the beginning of it, I'm actually going to be in the office all day on Saturday, just working on a few other things. So I'll be in and out if you guys need me. But hopefully I will see you guys then, if not in person on Zoom. And until then, I hope you guys have a really good week.
You too. Thanks, Melissa.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks for your time. Thank you so much that you came back to this.
Gosh, yes. I feel like I build more confidence when I know what I'm doing.
Yeah, for sure.
So,
And it's easier now that the boys are back in school. Like,
Yes.
you can come to the office
Yes.
and do some of these things. And
yeah, I'll be back here tomorrow and
Oh, good.
Thursday.
Oh,
So,
good.
yeah, I feel like now I can come back in more. And then the last month, they haven't had any camps or anything
Yes.
either. And then my little guy, he, since our dog passed away, he won't be home alone. Like, I can usually leave them for like an hour or two, like I'm okay with that. But he's like not comfortable being home alone without her being there. So it was just hard this last couple months, or last month especially. So
I'm sorry.
yeah, oh, thanks.
Do you think you'll get another dog?
I already have money down on it.
Good.
I was like, it's so funny, not funny, but this dog that passed away, she was only 8 when she died. It was unexpected. And we got her when the boys were 1 and 2, and I was very not wanting to get a puppy. And Tom was like, no, we have to have a dog. And like, he caught me at a weak moment. And so I agreed to it. And we got her, which I'm glad we did because I loved her. But at the time, I was like, no, and fighting it. And so now this time around, it's been opposite. I'm like, oh my gosh,